All right, today we're cracking open the playbook of a company that's absolutely central to Southeast Asia's food supply, PT Chirawan Pakpon, Indonesia. You probably know them as CPIN. We're going to take a look at a whole decade inside this food giant to really understand how they didn't just grow, but how they managed to adapt and survive in one of the most fast-paced markets on the planet. So yeah, let's get right into it.
I mean, think about that for a second. That's a huge question, right? For a company like CPIN, this isn't some thought experiment. It's their mission, every single day. And that one question, it really sets the stage for just how massive and complex their whole operation is. You're talking about logistics, economics, even biology, all tangled up together.
So, here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll look at the company's core blueprint. Then, we'll dive into their massive growth spurt. After that, we'll see how they handle the chaos of the market, put them to the test during a crisis, and finally, take a peek at what's coming down the road.
Okay, so first things first. To really get how CPIN works, you've got to understand their fundamental design. Because, this isn't just about selling a product. It's way bigger than that. It's about controlling the entire journey, literally, from the farm all the way to your dinner table.
And look, this company has been around for a while. We're talking since 1972. CPIN has been a cornerstone of Indonesia's agribusiness for decades. So for about half a century, they've been methodically building the infrastructure, the know-how, everything they need to tackle that huge challenge we kicked this off with.
And this right here, this is their secret sauce. It's a strategy called vertical integration. So what does that actually mean in plain English? Well, it means they control everything, the whole shebang. They make the feed for the chickens, they breed the chicks, they manage the farming, and then they process and ship out the final product. Having that kind of control, it's a huge advantage. It lets them manage quality, keep costs in check, and crucially, pivot fast when the market gets crazy.
Now, to really get their strategy, you gotta see where they came from. If you look at this snapshot from around 2015, one thing is crystal clear. Poultry feed was king. I mean, it made up almost 75% of their entire business. That was the bedrock, the foundation that everything else was built on. Remember that piece? Because it's gonna be important later. All right, so with that rock-solid foundation, what did they do next? Well, they didn't just sit back and relax. Not a chance. The next decade was all about aggressive, smart expansion. They had a really clear goal: move up the value chain and get closer to the customer.
And wow, just look at that number. A 115% explosion in their processed food segment. And that happened in just 4 years. This was no accident, folks. This was a calculated move. They were tapping into a growing middle class, rising incomes, and the huge demand for food that's easy, convenient, and good quality. Okay, so I've been throwing this term around a bit, DOCs. Let's just quickly clear up what that is. DOCs stands for day-old chicks, and they are quite literally the starting point for the whole poultry industry. CPIN sells these little guys to thousands and thousands of farmers who then raise them up to become either broilers for meat or layers for eggs. It's a super important link in the whole food chain.
But of course, when you're operating at this kind of scale, it's never a straight line to success. The global supply chain can be a really messy, chaotic place, and CPIN is always up against these massive forces that are just completely outside their control.
Yeah, there are two big monsters they're pretty much always wrestling with. First up, raw material prices. Think corn, think soy. Their prices can swing like crazy on the world market. And here's the kicker. Since they have to import a lot of it, they're also exposed to currency risk. So if the Indonesian rupiah gets weaker against the US dollar, bam! All those essential imports just got way more expensive overnight.
So, how do they fight back against all that uncertainty? Well, they've got a pretty clever playbook. On the money side, they use financial tools like futures contracts to lock in prices. It's a strategy called hedging, and it protects them from those wild price swings. Then, on the ground, they're always researching substitute raw materials to give them more options. And they work hand in hand with farmers on things like biosecurity to stop diseases from spreading. And finally, the big picture stuff. They pour money back into their own infrastructure, expanding their facilities and setting up distribution centers closer to their customers to make everything run smoother. Okay, so you've got this solid playbook, right? But every playbook, no matter how good, eventually gets put to the test. And in 2020, well, the world threw the ultimate stress test at basically every company on Earth.
Yeah, the pandemic hit, and it hit hard. Indonesia's economy actually shrank, and global supply chains just fell into total chaos. For a business like CPIN that depends on imports, unpredictable demand, and on incredibly complex logistics, this was the moment of truth.
a real perfect storm.
And you can see it right here in this quote from their own board in 2021. They basically said, hey, things were incredibly difficult, but we feel like we managed to do a pretty credible job. But, talk is one thing. The real question is, did the numbers actually back that up?
Well, have a look. The numbers really lay it all out. You can see that big hit they took in 2020. Their net income took a real dip. But what's truly amazing is how quickly they started to bounce back by 2022. And this right here is where that whole vertically integrated model really showed its true colors. Because they controlled the entire supply chain, they could adapt and get stable again way faster than other companies. The model bent, for sure, but it absolutely refused to break.
So, okay, after navigating a whole decade of growth, all that market volatility, and a literal global pandemic, what's next for CPIN? What's the plan to secure their future?
One of the best ways to check the health of a company is to look at its debt. This table shows their debt-to-equity ratio. It's just a simple way of saying how much do they owe compared to how much do they own. And the lower that number, the better. And what's really interesting is that even after all that expansion and surviving those crises, they've kept their debt low and totally manageable. That kind of financial discipline is so important. It gives them the stability to handle shocks and the freedom to keep investing in what's next.
And looking ahead, they've got some serious tailwinds pushing them forward. I mean, first you've got the demographics, a massive population of over 270 million people, with a growing middle class that's eating more protein. Then you look at the market. People in Indonesia still eat less chicken than in neighboring countries, which means there's just a huge runway for growth. And on top of all that, they're tackling their reliance on imports head-on by creating partnerships to get more corn locally. All the signs are pointing in the right direction.
And all of this brings us right back to where we started. The story of CPIN is so much more than just a business case study, right? It's really a deep dive into the engine that powers a nation's food supply. As Indonesia's population and its economy keep on growing, the playbook and the resilience of a giant like CPIN, well, it's not just going to decide their own success, it's going to play an absolutely critical role in shaping the future of food security for hundreds of millions of people.